There are lots of secrets or techniques that not many people know about when they first start pixel art. People see pixel art as seemingly easier than other mediums, and in some ways it's true. It's easier to pick up and control. But the limitations, like the smaller canvas size, in my opinion, makes it equally as challenging to master as any other art form. Lots of people think that art is all about talent and is like some sort of magic ability that some people just have and others don't. But really, all you need is some motivation, practice, and knowledge, and you're on your way. Recently, there have been a lot of videos like this on YouTube, but I wanted to give my own take on it and see what I can add or go further in depth with. In this video, I'll be unpicking a lot of hidden tips that you might not have known, especially if you're just starting pixel art, which will hopefully elevate your skill level and make your art even better than it already is. Firstly, a disclaimer. Pixel art has transcended its early roots of just being used as game art. It's no longer just an art style, but an entirely new medium. So, as with any art form, these tips don't apply everywhere, and will change based on context. However, they're very effective building blocks to use in most cases, and I'll be talking about exceptions as I'm showing you each tip. So, let's begin our journey of pixel art knowledge. Tip 1. Workflow. I recommend you all to find a workflow which best suits you. In pixel art, there are lots of different ways people rough out and then finalize their artworks. When drawing anything, especially if it's an organic, such as a character or an environment, I tend to create a very free sketch. I'll rough out the silhouette using blobs and geometric shapes. This gives me an idea of the shape language I want to use to convey the character's personality or the environment's atmosphere. I do a small explanation of shape language in my second pixel art tutorial here. But to summarize, shape language is what you convey through the form and simple geometry of any art, giving it personality. Square or rectangular framework is typically representative of a strong, sturdy, or reliable character, like the knight in Shovel Knight. Triangular shapes signify dangerous or deceptive, an example being basically just spikes in all games. And circles are round to imply soft, safe, or friendly designs, like Kirby. Another very popular method of roughing out a design is through construction lines. Although a sketch is very general and free, construction lines provide a simple way to work out anatomy, proportions, posing, and structure very easily. With characters, this often means stickmen, and you typically build up the real shape using the lines as a base. These techniques can change depending on what you're drawing too. So, for example, it's not likely that you'd use construction lines for an organic background, as you're less looking for specific placement and more for an atmosphere or composition for the whole piece in that situation. So don't think you have to stick to one technique. But no matter what technique you use, remember to work on the whole piece in stages at a time. I don't recommend doing a character segment by segment in detail, because then the entire design as a whole may turn out inconsistent, especially with lighting. So make sure to have a base and add color and shading gradually, rather than focusing on completing smaller segments at a time. Tip 2. Line work. Even if you're using a style without any outline, the shape of your art is still governed by basic lines. When drawing lines in pixel art, there are two main techniques that you should avoid using inconsistently, these being doubles and jaggies. So, what are they? Firstly, doubles are probably the easiest to spot, and are basically when pixels overlap each other in a line. For example, if you're trying to do a curve but there are doubles, the arc might look a bit off, as it gives the impression of the segments on a line moving up and across and up again, rather than being a smooth curve. Removing these is simple and looks much cleaner in general once you do. There are also many art styles where artists purposefully use doubles or layered pixels for an outline to show emphasis. It's all about consistency and placement, because if you mix both doubles and non-doubles into a single outline, it ends up looking messy. Here are some exceptions though. Notice how when you're trying to portray a sharp object, you want to add a double to show that it's almost like a corner piece or a sharp point. This sword, or even something more subtle like the hair on this character, are examples of this. You just have to know the right situations to use them. Okay, now onto jaggies. Jaggies are something I see a lot more than doubles, and is when a line is uneven or jagged, hence the name. Here you can see that the segments of this line are unbalanced, and they almost look random lengths, going 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, and so on. In an artwork, this would look jagged, so what you want to do is smooth it out. A good way of doing this is to either go back and try and modify the line into something more even. For example, I've seen styles where they leave gaps in the line to still give the look of a gradual slant without keeping to the restriction of pixel art angles as much. Or you could start with an already even line and draw shapes from that. Notice how removing the jags and doubles from this piece makes the entire image look so much cleaner and nicer to look at, especially when zoomed out. But just to emphasize again, they aren't always bad, you just have to know how to intentionally use them to create the effect you want. Tip 3. Shading and color. I know this is a very query topic for people not only starting out, but even at an intermediate level. And I also used to have a lot of trouble with shading before, but once you understand the basics, it becomes really simple. So, pixel art shading is really the same as any other art form, as light will still work in the same way. The only real difference is the number of colors or tones in an image being smaller. In pixel art, using a gradient isn't as common, and takes away from what's unique about pixel art, being its clean, readable style. I'd recommend only around 1 to 2 shadow tones, 1 midtone and 1 highlight tone, but it definitely differs depending on context, the size of the artwork, and the style. You can see that adding too many tones here makes it look a bit messy because pixel art tends to shade or block out colors in what's known as clusters. Singular, seemingly random pixels on their own, or singular colors, will cause noise, so removing them, like this, will help readability. Although there'll be varying degrees of light hitting the object everywhere, let's say if the light source was here, there are some things which you should consider to be more important for pixel art, to get the shape across clearly. Firstly, the most obvious one is the cast shadow on the ground, to show that the object is on the floor and that the environment is reacting to its presence. Next, you should understand how the light travels, so less and less light rays hit the object the further you go from a source. This creates a specular highlight, which is close to a shade of white, right where the most light hits. Then the further out you go, there's a slightly less intense highlight, a midtone, then the terminator, which is just the blur or transition to the shadow, then the core shadow. I normally start with the midtone, then go from there, as it's easiest to start with looking at the base color, rather than starting from the lightest or darkest. Now for a flatter example. Here's a cube. You can see that due to the limited color palette, each side only has 1 or at most 2 colors, making it consistent and readable. One thing to remember is to not do pillow shading. Pillow shading, created from a technique known as banding, which are tones wrapping around the object, is when you don't consider the form of the object, but think of it as the light source itself, leading to a very flat or odd-looking shape. It seems simple not to do, but I still sometimes fall into this trap, especially with more complex geometries and shape. For these more complex objects, you really just have to try and think about them as if they were in real life or in a 3D plane, which might seem hard to do, but a lot of it does just come down to common sense, and just being more observant in real life. Finally, I want to talk about hue shifting. Hue shifting refers to how shades and tints not only change in brightness, but also in hue, based on the environment, color of the object, and the intensity of the highlight or shadow. Here's an example. You can see that the teddy bear on the left looks nicer than the one on the right, because in a way it's more vibrant. Typically, you'd shift highlights to a warmer color, so towards red or yellow, and shift shadows towards a blue or purple, whichever's closer. Using this will make your colors look less murky, and overall make your art look more vivid or aesthetic. Some circumstances that you'd want to limit hue shifting, however, is when you're going for a much more dramatic or serious tone. In this case, murkier and desaturated colors work effectively at conveying the realism or tension. This character is someone you might find in a small adventure game, whereas this character might be in a dramatic story-based action game. To reiterate, it's all about the intent and learning how to utilize techniques depending on context. Tip 4. Anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is a technique that not many beginners know about, but it's basically the process of using singular or orphan pixels on the edges of an object, or at the border between 2 different tones, to make an object blend together better. It has a lot of other uses too, such as giving the impression of a small shadow, or being used to show a terminator, which is meant to give a softer or more blurry impression. When you take a picture in real life and zoom in, you can see a similar effect, where on the edges of the object, there's almost a color transitioning the object to the environment, as your camera blends it slightly. It's quite easy to overdo this, or do too little and leave it looking a bit strange, so it takes a while to get used to where it should and shouldn't be placed. Here you can see that too little still makes the object appear flat, but too much makes it fuzzy or unclear, similarly to the banding effect I was talking about. Typically, the color used to anti-alias will be very similar to the core color, but slightly darker. However, in some situations, like this character, I've purposefully used a lighter color to convey slight highlights. Another technique similar to anti-aliasing in style is dithering, where you use a hatch-like pattern to give the impression of a color in between the two being used in the pattern, and the value of the color seemingly changes depending on how much of each color you use. You can test this by moving away from your device slightly and seeing that the color of this small square seems to change, even though it's just your eyes tricking you to see a flat-toned color rather than seeing two separate colors. It's a method to both add texture and extra tones to your art without having to introduce new colors. Use it sparingly, however, as it can lead to decreased readability if it's everywhere. It depends on the style, again. Tip 5. Draw what you want to draw. This is less technique-based, but it's more general advice when practicing what you're weak in. For example, I really wanted to get better at drawing poses, so I took some references and tried to analyze proportions, anatomy, and how the body shape is conveyed in different styles. I would try and use a reference and basically copy out poses geometrically in monochromatic color palette, and it really did seem to help. I didn't just copy the image pixel for pixel, but by stealing art I liked, I was able to break down in my head how it worked, and over time I got better. The same advice applies for literally anything you want to get better at. Drawing clouds, making games feel good to play, composing music, and when you use what you like to improve your skill, especially in art, it's very easy to see progression. This also links to the fact that even if you find something difficult, practice using what you like to draw it. Yes, I want to draw anatomy, but there was no reason for me to practice American cartoon-style proportions if I didn't want to learn that. I drew mainly from real-life references and Japanese manga characters, because that's the area or aspect of the art that I wanted to improve. Tackle certain techniques or studies in your own time, and try not to rush, try and pace yourself, otherwise you'll be left feeling unmotivated. Also, just because you use the reference doesn't mean that you shouldn't be proud of it. Copy art is a skill in its own right, and if you get used to drawing from reference and start doing it less and less each time, eventually you'll be able to draw from imagination or memory by putting the skills you learned from copy art into your original art. The only rule is to not directly copy from other people and claim it as your own. Plagiarism really isn't that great. So those are my top tips for creating and improving your pixel art skills. I hope you learned something, and if you did, here's a small exercise. Try taking some art that you're proud of and applying some of the new things you learned to it, just to see how it could be improved or even just modified slightly, as you now have a different perspective on your own art. Critiquing your own art, as well as being proud of what you make, are both extremely important in progression. Having a balance of both is really the way you can improve and become a better artist. Anyway, I'll see you all in another video, or in the Discord server. Until then, bye!